All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm currently in Tools and Testing, and we're talking cross-browser testing. As it says, this article starts the module off by providing an overview of what cross-browser testing is. All right, it also talks about common types of problems you'll encounter when trying to do cross-browser testing. What are the main approaches for testing, identifying, and fixing those problems? All right, cross-browser testing here is defined as the practice of making sure that websites and web apps you create work across an acceptable number of web browsers. So in other words, ideally, if I bring up, let's just say, let's grab here, I don't know. Let's go to CNN.com. All right, there is CNN.com, and there it is on Firefox. I'm sorry, there it is on Chrome. Well, let's bring it up on Firefox. And the idea is if I do that, and I take this one and I move it so it takes up about half the screen, and I take this one and I move it so that it takes up about half the screen. All right. And this won't be perfect, but you're getting the idea. The idea is that these should look as close to possible as being the same on each browser. All right, so here it is in Chrome, and here it is in Firefox. Now, is it perfect? Well, heck no. But it doesn't look too bad. It pretty much looks the same as far as I can tell on both. All right. So it says, as a web developer, it is your responsibility to make sure that not only do your projects work, but they work for all users, regardless of the browser, the device, or additional assistive tools they're using. You need to think about different browsers, different devices with different capabilities, and people with disabilities. So again, you also want to make sure that if you've got something like this and you start shrinking down your browser size, that it looks as nice as possible. Here is the site we're currently looking at, and you can see it. So for instance, if I were to have gone in and come in here and go to the developer tools, so I'll go to my inspect, and if I were to go in here and choose this second one, which toggles my device toolbar, and where are we here? This is, for example, what it looks like on an iPhone X. Well, let's look on a Pixel. There you go. And you see it still looks nice. If I bring it up on an iPad, still looks nice. And if I bring it up on an iPad Pro, which is almost the way that it would look if we didn't have this open or this was shrunk way down. So this is pretty much the way it looks on my regular screen right now anyway. All right. Says, remember that you are not your users. Just because a site looks good on a MacBook Pro or a high-end Galaxy Nexus doesn't mean it'll look good for everybody on every single machine they have. All right, my youngest daughter has a $150 Chromebook that she uses for virtually everything she does. My older brother, again, has a Chromebook. It's one step up higher, but he paid about $250 for it. So make the web work for everyone. Provides more useful perspective on different browsers and people, so you click that link if you're interested. All right, we should explain a few bits of terminology here to start with. When we talk about sites working across browser, we're really saying they should provide an acceptable UX or user experience across different browsers. It is potentially okay for a site to not deliver the same exact UX on all browsers as long as the core of functionality is accessible in some way. So again, not every site will look the same on Firefox as it will look on Edge, as it will look on um, Chrome, etc. On modern browsers, you might get something animated 3D and shiny, whereas on older browsers, you might get a flat graphic representing the same information. As long as the site owner is happy with this, you've done your job. On the other hand, it is not okay for a site to work fine for sighted users, but be completely inaccessible for the visual impaired. All right. Second, as mentioned there, when we say across an acceptable number of web browsers, that typically isn't going to be 100%. Again, we've talked about this as far as, IE6. All right. If we did this, I'm going to just go into Google here and say percentage of people using different browsers and versions and their versions. I don't know if this is what I'm looking for or not, but usage share of web browsers. All right. So let's see. Well, it says that 64 or 63.5% are using Chrome. That number would probably be higher, but Safari comes built in on iOS devices. That's why. And look at the number for Firefox. Look at the number for IE and for Edge. Now that was 2020, so it may be similar. It may have changed a bit. The point is this, though. We don't even have the different versions in here. All right. But you can already look at it and say, well, you know what? If I do plan for the big three here, so if I try to make it, so we get 63.5, 19, so that's about 83%. And for that's around 87% right there. But again, we're not talking about different versions. That's the usage of the browser. Can we say different browser versions? I don't know. All right, well, that breaks it up like that. But looking down here, it said browser market share worldwide. I don't know if this is what I'm looking for or not here. So again, these are different versions of Chrome, but we'd have to go through and look at different versions of Internet Explorer, etc. All right. What percentage of users use Internet Explorer? All right. And there's the numbers. And if you look at it overall and you'd average it, it looks like it's around 3%. All right. Why do cross-browser issues occur? Well, first of all, let's just mention that they've occurred forever. And in fact, again, if I go back here and I type in original browser wars, all right, the original browser wars were in the late 1990s. And it was basically Internet Explorer versus Mozilla. You say, I don't even know what Mozilla is. Well, kind of. It was the Netscape. It was Netscape's Navigator. All right. And as it says, look at that. It says it was a proprietary web browser and the original browser for the Netscape line. All right. I think, at least, maybe I'm wrong here, it's kind of morphed into Firefox. But the point is, originally, there was basically Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator. And each one of them, or both of them, tended to do things in their own way. So in other words, they thought there was a way of doing things and that was the way they were going to do it. That's when cross-browser issues occurred. Sometimes browsers have bugs, but this was the main reason. They implemented features differently. As it says, the situation was a lot less bad as opposed to the way it used to be. Back when IE4 and Netscape 4 were competing to be the dominant browser in the 90s. Browser companies deliberately implemented things differently to try to gain a competitive advantage. All right. Some browsers may have different levels of technology, support for different features. Some devices may have constraints that cause a website to run slowly or badly. There are people that I know of that, for example, even though they get Safari on their iPhone, they still will go in and download Chrome or Firefox because they hate Safari. So sometimes people have an internal bias against certain things. All of this cross-browser testing business, as it says, may sound time-consuming and scary, but you need to plan for it. It's something that should be baked into what you're working on. So as mentioned, if you're working on a large project, you should be testing it regularly, making sure that new features work. And what I showed you before, as far as going in there and inspecting and going in and choosing this, these are emulators. This is not really a Pixel device right here. It's an emulator, so it's something emulating that device. So you still have to test it out on devices. All right, what did I do here? All right. It says if you leave all the testing to the end of the project, any bugs you uncover will be a lot more expensive and time consuming. Just to tell you real quick, I'm stepping out of the bounds of this, and it might be something you could care less about. But back in the 1980s, I was working at AT&T Bell Laboratories. All right, and I was a C programmer. Well, I had been doing what I was doing for about 2.5 years, and I was frustrated because the area I was in, they weren't promoting a lot of people, and I felt I shouldn't say needed, but I deserved a promotion. So I went over to a software testing group for the last year I was there. And one of the reasons I did was I wanted to find out how expensive it was to fix things. And they figured that if you were really early in the development cycle and you found an error and you fixed it, it would run 50 to maybe $250. The most expensive error that I heard of was literally someone who forgot to put a default case in their code for something because they said it would never happen. Well, it happened, and it was $5 million. And you say, well, how could it cost $5 million to fix it? It wasn't $5 million to fix it. It literally caused uh, this again back in the 80s when we had rotary phones and the like, but it literally caused a part of New York's phone system to go down on the Friday before Mother's Day. All right, until about that next Monday. And that's how much they figured that they lost in revenue. All right. So planning, development, testing, fixing. It says steps 2 to 4 tend to be repeated as many times as necessary. So this loops is what they're saying. In the initial planning phase, you will probably have several planning meetings with the site owner, and it's more important as time goes on to keep the person or persons that you're developing for in the loop at all points. At this point, it says you'll also want to know how much time you have to develop the site. What is their deadline? How much are they going to pay you? And it's also very important at that time that you get them to sign off on something that says, this is what I'm going to do, and this is in the time frame I'm going to give it to you. I have been a part of projects before where you're real close to finishing up the project and somebody says, what about this feature? Again, when I was at AT&T, people came up 6 weeks before we were supposed to cut over a new telephone switching system and said, what about this feature? It had never been brought up before. It was not in any of the specifications. The thing that we were creating for them cost between 20 and $25 million. So it was about $22.5 million. And they'd already paid 12 million. And they said, we need this new feature. We said, well, we can't give it to you. And they said, well, then we don't want it. We'll eat the other 10 million. We gave it to them, but it ended up cutting over a little later than thought of. So it's important to have an idea of the required feature set from the get-go. It says, now you know your testing platforms, you should go back and review the required feature set and technologies you're going to use. For example, if the web owner wants the site owner wants a WebGL Power 3D tour, you'll need to accept that. It won't work in earlier versions of IE, for example. You should compile a list of potential problem areas, and that list will grow as time goes on. You can't plan for everything. All right, you can find browser information on Can I Use. We've been looking at that throughout this entire series of videos. Now on to the development of the site. You should split the different parts up into modules. All right. And again, this has become more and more important as time has gone on. You might have heard of terms like DevOps, etc. What has happened over time is rather than having a big project that is due maybe a year or a year and a half from now, you have a series of mini projects, each one of which is due in 6 to 8 weeks, for example. All right. And that's why you end up breaking your site up into different areas. And as it says, you might even further subdivide these areas. There are multiple strategies for browser development. For example, get all the functionality working as closely as possible in all target browsers. Accept that some things aren't going to work the same on all browsers and provide acceptable solutions. Accept that your site won't work with older browsers and move on. Now it says this is okay, provided your client user base is okay with it. If you've got if you're creating a site that you know the majority of the people that are using it are going to be retired people, they very well may have older machines or not. So this may be something that they wouldn't agree with. All right, then you go into testing and discovery. At each implementation phase, you will need to test the new functionality. To start with, you should make sure there's no general issues in your code. Test it on stable browsers. Do some lo-fi accessibility testing, trying the site only with your keyboard, etc. Test it on a mobile platform. All right. Every time you run a program, in essence, you are testing it because there's something that might happen that you never planned on having happen before. Somebody hits a weird keyboard combination or whatever. At any point, fix the problems that you find. Next, try expanding your list of test browsers. All right. If you've got the means to test all different browser and operating system and device combinations, all right, you do it. If you don't, you use emulators. For instance, I know people who do this for a living, and you can type in, for example, Internet Explorer emulator. All right, and notice, test your sites in IE6, IE7, IE8. So rather than you going and downloading a version of that, that might be something that you want to do, is download an emulator instead. Another option is user groups, employing people from the outside to test the site. Now it says this could be friends or family, but there are people who are actually professional testers. All right, I know again, when I worked at AT&T, when you got done with your project, you weren't done. You had to give it to what was called the system test people. Their job literally was to break your code. And if they could break your code, it was considered a success. Not because it was broken, but better they break it while it's still in-house than once you submit it to somebody and actually put it out there in the field. Finally, as it says, you can get smarter with your testing using auditing and automation tools. And this will be discussed later on in here also. It's often a good idea on pre-release versions of browsers to test as well. All right, so if you know something is coming out in the future. This is especially prevalent if you're using very new technologies in your site and you want to test it against the latest and greatest. Or if you come across a bug in the latest version of a browser and you want to see if the browser's developers have fixed it. You know, what does that mean? Well, if you remember, earlier when I went out to nodejs.org, I mentioned LTS and current. The LTS stands for long-term support. That's a version that's been out there, that's been running for a while, that's been tested. The current, you'll notice there's a big difference between 14.7.0 and 16.3. It has the latest features, but it could be potentially buggy. There could be some bugs in there. So most people, for example, in here, they'd use this. But if they wanted to test everything possible, they might download this one as well and have two different versions running. Once you've discovered a bug, you need to try to fix it. The first thing that you do, as it says, is to try to narrow down the bug where it occurs as much as possible. All right. A lot of times in your site, this might be things like, for example, with a JavaScript. All right. So with a JavaScript, you would go in and you'd go into the console. One thing we haven't even discussed in here, actually we have a lot earlier, is the W3. Let's just put HTML validator. Oops, validator. All right. So if I bring up that validation markup service, and you've already seen stuff like this, but let's grab something that's probably a smaller site. So let's see. Browser Wars. I don't know how big this will be. View page source. All right. It's big enough. I'm going to do a Control A, Control C. I'm going to grab all of their code, and I'm going to throw it in, if I can, inside of here. And I'm going to click check. Now it's going to take a minute, but you'll notice, look at all these errors. Now it still comes out and it still resonates, but there's $79 total things, of which it looks like 68 are errors and about 10 of them are warnings. Now, with some of these errors, they may what are considered to be acceptable errors, meaning they're things that don't stop the page from showing, but they're things that maybe you're using the wrong syntax or whatever. All right. Again, errors may not be your fault. If a bug exists in a browser, then hopefully the vendor will fix it. If it is your fault, it's up to you to fix it. Once a fix has been made, as it says, you'll want to repeat your testing process. All right. If you discover bugs in browsers, you should support them. So this article was very, very quickly, gave you hopefully a high-level understanding of what cross-browser testing was about. So in the next go around here, we will talk about strategies for carrying out testing. Be back with that shortly.